everyone. I'm Christine Tully, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead, and welcome to episode 284, interview with Laura Vanderkam, author of Big Time, which just came out this week. And Laura's going to talk to us today about some productivity habits that we can apply to our lives as academics. What we're going to start with today is I'm just going to chat with Laura a little bit about her research for Big Time and some of the findings that she found for that project. So, Laura, tell us a little bit about your project.
Yeah, so Big Time is about what happens in life when we start to view time as abundant rather than scarce. I really do think that this mindset shift can help us feel better about time and our lives in general. I really do think it is possible to fall in love with your schedule, and that is my goal for everybody reading this book.
That's amazing. Academic schedules are notoriously crammed, and one of the things that I know I was really intrigued when I was looking at the table of contents. You had it set up in there where one of the chapters is about golden hours. Can you tell us a little bit about those golden hours?
Yeah, so the golden hours are the hours after work and before bed on weekdays. And you might think of it as people talk about your golden years after you retire, and the years when retirees can enjoy family time and leisure time. And we get a little version of that every day after work. You can enjoy family and leisure time. But we all know that weekday evenings are incredibly hard to use well because people are tired. They're trying to get through the have-to-dos. But generally, the have-to-dos don't consume the entirety of the evening. A lot of people are done with work or work-related activities by 5:30, 6 p.m. They go to bed 10 p.m. or later. We're talking 4 to 5 hours in the evenings, and this can be used for rejuvenation, for socializing, for relaxing. A lot of us instead wind up spending a lot of it on our electronic hobbies of doom scrolling and, checking social media comments. And I'm just on a campaign to get people to change the balance.
I like the idea of thinking about this, and I think I read about this in your other book, The Tranquility by Tuesday, and kind of thinking through different ways to work. And I think you framed it as like a mini adventure that you could, if I remember that right, like pull it off during the week. And I was thinking a little bit about golden hours in the context for academics as some time to reset our brains. We do a lot of very hardcore kind of thinking, but also we have, just the way higher education is right now, a lot of annoying things. There's a lot of assessment projects, there's reports. More of us are teaching more classes with more students who need more. The email is 24/7. And I like the idea of the golden hours in the evening, it also combined with thinking through that, this could be a time for sort of like a mini adventure, a way to kind of reset ourselves during the week. Because, the fact is in academia right now that it's a pretty high stress job. And it's usually presented to us as, oh, you'll have all this leisure time to think and do all these great things. But that's kind of not how it pans out.
Yeah, no, you can definitely do a reset during the week. I mean, it's about a mindset shift that the week doesn't have to be terrible and awful. Just because it's Tuesday doesn't mean that life has to feel overwhelming and tedious. Now, obviously, there are things that have to happen on Tuesdays, but even if you do decide that in the evening, I'm going to, let's say, work for an hour to get through this amount of stuff, you could also decide that desires can exist alongside have-to-dos. I'm encouraging people to just come up with something for 30 minutes that you can do that you enjoy. It could be reading a book that's for fun, not anything related to work.
No school related
No
work, no
school related
research
work.
articles.
I mean, unless you're really, really into it. You could, do a puzzle. You could walk outside, go on a little family adventure, like you said. But something you'd find enjoyable for 30 minutes beyond the have-to-dos. And that gives you a sense that these golden hours actually happened.
I love the reframe, particularly, when we think about your writing schedule or your schedule in general, and you mentioned like kind of falling in love with it. I remember was in the introduction. And one of the things that we do at Defend, Publish, and Lead, we work with academics to think through how can we make scholarly writing more enjoyable, and how do we find those blocks of writing time in our schedule. And it sounds like just in the simple reframe that There's actually quite a lot of time if we think about it. And I know you talked about, I think it was about not thinking about a day in 24 hours. I might have the math wrong, but can you say something about that, like kind of reframing time in that way?
Well, that we tend to live our lives in weeks, which is 168 hours. We
Hmm.
often think of our lives in days, but we live our lives in weeks. And so a lot of people in various different fields, but certainly academia, will get frustrated looking at any given day because in one 24-hour period, it might be challenging to fit several classes, grading work, the various service you have to do for academia and writing and publishing, and of course, the stuff in your personal life, whether it's being with your family, the household chores you have to do. Maybe you have friends, maybe you have exercise you want to do, like, all this stuff. We're like, well, it doesn't necessarily all fit in 24 hours. And I agree. There are not enough hours in the day to get to everything we want to get to. But we don't live our lives in weeks, in days. We live our lives in weeks. And so if you look at the whole of the week, you see how much space you might have. And so, yes, any given day it might be hard, but could we find like, you know, 2 hour blocks 3 or 4 times a week to do this deeper work? That's a different question. That is, can I find 6 to 8 hours in 168 hours? And I'm guessing that most people can. So when you view time a little bit more broadly, it starts to seem more a question of possibility as opposed to these very harsh trade offs.
Oh, I love this idea that the bucket of time just seems bigger versus looking at a horribly crammed day.
or
Yeah.
or go even bigger. I mean, this is the mindset of big time. A year has 8,760 hours. So
Mhm.
if we are aiming for 6 to 8 hours a week out of 50 weeks a year, we are talking 300, 400 hours. Again, a year has 8,760 hours, so 300, 400 hours seems smaller compared to
Mhm.
that. Now, in any given day, it might be challenging, but if we look at the whole of the year, it starts to seem like a smaller proportion.
Makes sense. So let's switch gears for a minute. You've written a lot of books, and I know a lot of people listen to our podcast because they want to know how to get the writing done. They want to know about movement and they want to know about completion. So, how are you making little progress on writing projects here and there? And then how are you actually making sure they get out the door? And since you've written a lot of books, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit just about writing habits, writing schedule. Where are you putting that in your own weekly or monthly schedule?
Yeah, it's always still a challenge because there are various other things I do other than just write. I mean, between, podcasts and speaking and the shorter term stuff that I'm writing, making time for writing the longer term things is always more challenging. Now, the upside is I often do have deadlines. So a deadline is something you can execute against. But as everyone knows, you can't do it at the last minute. So if I have a book deadline in 6 months, which is the case, then I need to be carving out time every week for the work that needs to happen to do that. And so I've set a goal of having all my research done by a certain chunk of time, and then I need to execute against doing that. Then I have a set amount of time for writing, and then again, I'm carving out a couple hours multiple times a week to keep coming back to the project, and then leaving enough time for things to go wrong or to come back to the manuscript as I see more, all of that before the deadline. But the good news is, when you do touch things repeatedly over a long period of time, things come to you that you couldn't see at the beginning. It's the habit of repeatedly coming back to something that opens connections in your brain that you simply wouldn't have seen before. So I like to think of this as time working with you, that time is your friend. Time is, I guess, your research assistant in a way,
Oh, that's
helping
great.
you get to this. But to do that, you need to give time enough runway to make that happen, right? And so the further back we can go, and the more we can just repeatedly come back to something again and again, that's where time works its magic.
Oh, that's great. So I didn't tip you off that I was going to ask this question, but since you've written so many books, do you have a favorite or a project? It could be, and it could be a favorite for a different reason. So for example, like I know I have some books that I really enjoyed working on them. Maybe I liked, a content in another book better, but I liked the progress. It could be a favorite for any reason, but do you have one that stands out or One that you have fond memories of.
Well, I
Not
really
not big time, because
well,
that one's coming out. Pick a
yeah,
path.
that's coming out. But although I really did enjoy writing this one, it's my favorite topics in time, and just given a chance to run with those.
Yeah.
Um, I love all my books. I wouldn't say there's, it's like having a favorite child, I guess. But I
Yep.
know how she does it sort of stands out in my mind because it was something I had wanted to write for a while. That instead of, people talk about work and life, in particular in looking at women's life choices, um, often from this lens of scarcity, that there is not enough time to build a big career, have a thriving, happy family, and have time for yourself. And I think that is a ridiculous notion. There are, in fact, enough hours in the week, hours in the year to spend adequate time on all of these things. And to prove that, I had, many, many women who had big jobs and who were also raising children to track their time for a week. I looked at the results. I found that they were doing all kinds of amazing things. I mean, they weren't working around the clock, even though they had big jobs. I think, people often overestimate how much time a big job will take. They were sleeping enough. They were spending time with family. Most were exercising, reading, spending time with friends. A lot can fit in 168 hours. And so rather than having this harsh narrative of, no one can have it all, let's look at the people who do and celebrate what they're doing and seeing what the rest of us can learn from them.
Oh, that's awesome. In that book, I know we've talked about this before on your podcast, but that's the inspiration for a book that I did on rec comp moms. And I've talked about that on this podcast before, but for anybody that wants to check it out, it's a book about time use for academic motherhood. So specifically, like, where are these academic moms putting in writing? And I know, speaking of books for Laura, I will put in some notes in our show notes to her website, so you can see links to all of her books and you can check out all the ones that we've been talking about. But before we close the episode, I do want to find out from Laura. I want to present something to you first, and then I want to get your advice. A lot of the clients that we're working with right now will come to us primarily to help move writing forward, get it out the door, complete writing. But also, one of the things that's happening in higher education is our schedules are increasingly fragmented. Meetings are taking up more time, emails are taking up more time. And it's the kind of thing where, we'll look at schedules and try to say, okay, let's find some time that you're going to get this manuscript completed. And we'll look at somebody's schedule and we'll see all these little holes across the week. 30 minutes here, 42 minutes here, 55 here, maybe one or two bigger blocks of like 2 hours. And, it's because many of these academics are teaching, say, 5 classes now instead of 4. So that's another class that's meeting 3 times a week. And now they're also on this committee. And, this is not necessarily by choice, the way that our schedules are functioning this way, but we're starting to see more and more of them. And so one of the things that I wondered if you could give us is sort of your 3 across the board, from all your books, 3 favorite strategies for somebody with a very fragmented schedule that wants to get some deep work completed, because I think that's what we're bumping up against. So any 3 you want to tell us about?
Yeah, well, number one is what it would be number one for anyone, which is to track your time for at least a week. So you can see it's one thing to say, oh, email seems to take a lot of my time. Let's find out how much of your time it is taking. It's one thing to say my schedule is incredibly fragmented. Let's see exactly where the fragments are. Let's see what time is available. Let's see what the contours of like life look like. So track your time for at least 168 hours, writing down exactly what you are doing, in as much detail as you think will be helpful for you, because the data is going to allow you to make better choices, no matter what your schedule looks like. The second
Okay.
strategy I would say is that every busy person needs a designated weekly planning time. And this is when you look at the upcoming week and you make decisions about where things can go, because it's not going to occur to you when you've got a 42-minute break between classes that I should dive right into this part of my research that could be done in 35 minutes. It's not going to occur to you. You need to know that ahead of time. So you need to have a time that you step outside your schedule and look at the upcoming time, figure out what is most important to have happen, both professionally and personally, figure out roughly where those things can go. And then I would also stress that people need a backup slot, because I think what drives people crazy with these fragmented schedules is like you have, maybe only 1 2 hour block or 2 2 hour blocks where you're going to do your research, and then one gets taken away from you, right? Because
Yep.
a family member is sick, or there's, a power outage at your school, or there, something happens, right? Life always happens. Rather than be like, this is, nothing can happen, we're, throw up our hands in despair, have a backup slot. Figure out, okay, if I've got these 2 2 hour blocks where I'm going to do my research, where is the third? If one of those two is
Yeah.
taken away from me, where is the third that I can use? And it may not be during the 9 to 5 sort of work day. It may be that you have the option of, you know, maybe your partner takes the kids to school on Thursdays. And so that morning could be an option, like before your academic schedule starts. Maybe it's that you could trade off with somebody on the weekend, or you could hire a sitter for a couple hours on the weekend, but you have that in place if you need it. Or in the evening, perhaps, like, maybe your kid is at competitive gymnastics for 3 hours. Well, that's a beautiful block that you could use. Maybe you don't want to work in the evening, but if need be, you totally could. And so figure out where that backup slot is. And that way, even when life happens, you keep making progress on your goals.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, and these are some of the things that we've talked about on the podcast before. One thing I'll also link in the show notes is I had this very scenario where I had a beautiful kind of 3 hour block to get some writing done. Of course, I had the call from the school to pick up the sick kid. And one of the things I did on that episode, and it's one of our older episodes, but I did show this on YouTube how I got the time back. I said, all right, these are all things I moved around to make the slot. And I like that idea about making sure that there's one in there every week. It's not just one of those things like, well, I could kind of make one. That's what I did in my episode. I said, okay, here's how I got my writing back. But it would have been better for me not to even have to shuffle anything, that the backup slot was already there. And of course, if you end up not needing to use it, I'm sure we could use it for some golden hour type activities. So,
Absolutely. You'll fill the time with something. I wouldn't worry about that.
yeah, for sure. So, all right. Well, I appreciate the conversation with Laura today, and I encourage everybody to go and check out Big Time. It's out this week. There will be a link in our show notes and also to her website, so you can look at all of her other books because we talked about a lot of them today. Laura, any last thought you want to add before we close our episode?
Yeah, please come visit me at lauravanderkam.com. You can learn all about my stuff there. And, if you take nothing else from this, I think you should try tracking your time, because people think it's like about playing gotcha, like, oh, I feel so busy and look, there's an hour of Netflix. No, no, no. It's about making sure that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives are true. Because when we know where the time goes, we can make sure that we have time for all the things that are important to us. And I want that for everybody.
That's a great note to close on. All right. Happy writing, everybody.